LA, 1984. Small-time film director Jamie Chandere receives a mysterious package in the mail. It's an envelope with no return address postmarked Albuquerque, New Mexico. Inside is a roll of black and white film. Chandere develops it and discovers photographs of 8 pages from a classified government document. They appear to be a briefing dated November 18, 1952 for incoming President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The documents discuss Operation Majestic-12, or MJ-12, which is a top-secret committee of senior military, intelligence, and scientific officials to investigate the UFO crash outside Roswell in 1947. The pages also offer details about the nature of the recovered alien craft, as well as 4 extraterrestrial biological entities, or EBEs, found near the crash site. These documents, known as the MJ-12 papers, are now a cornerstone in modern ufology. But the key question is, are they real?
Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
That was former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld admitting that the Pentagon had somehow lost track of $2.3 trillion. The next day, of course, this happened. And Rumsfeld's $2.3 trillion admission became old news very fast.
And what we're watching on planet Earth, what we've been watching since 1947, is you see huge sections of the financial system and the sort of map of the financial money, and there's nothing on the other side of the balance sheet. There's like this big question mark. And do you ever feel like the official reality and reality are getting further and further and further apart until your head is like a bungee rope?
That's Catherine Austin Fitts. She was a former investment banker at Dillon Read & Company, and also the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for President George H.W. Bush.
Read my lips.
She has spent the last several decades investigating large-scale government fraud. She alleges that this fraud is to the tune of tens of trillions of dollars.
My guess is between the missing money, the pump and dump of the stock market, and the bailouts, including what the Federal Reserve has done, my estimate is during that period, the financial coup d'etat, I call it, $40 trillion got transferred over into this hidden system.
But here's what's different about Fitts. In her view, these missing trillions are not the result of either mismanagement or corruption. Speaking about her time at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, she explained why corruption alone would not have worked.
HUD at the time is on a matrix structure. HUD is controlled and operated by and with the New York Fed, the New York Fed member banks, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Justice, and inadvertently some of the intelligence agencies in the military. And it is run by the largest defense contractors in the world, or was then. So Lockheed Martin had the lead contract, $150 million a year to run all their operations. So you cannot run HUD as a criminal enterprise unless all of those entities are helping you run HUD as a criminal enterprise. That's not corruption, that's a system. That's a plan.
Not corruption, but a system. If she's right about that, and there's a good chance she is, and all the missing trillions can't be explained by the usual suspects, incompetence, corruption, bureaucracy, then that begs the question, where is the money going? What are the powers that be spending it on? In short, what are they doing with it? If you ask anyone what the most famous UFO case in American history is, they will tell you Roswell. This is where an alleged UFO crashed in the deserts of New Mexico on July 4th, 1947. Yet the modern age of the UFO and all the mythology that goes with it, it didn't start at Roswell. It started 2 weeks earlier, a few miles south of Seattle, Washington. The following story has a lot of setup, and there's no way to cut it down. But I promise, there is a payoff at the end. On June 21st, 1947, a harbor patrolman named Harold A. Dahl maneuvered his boat into the Maury Island Bay, which is part of Puget Sound, to avoid bad weather. He had 2 crewmen aboard, as well as his teenage son and his dog. Together, they spotted 6 donut-shaped UFOs hovering overhead at about 2,000 feet. One of them looked damaged and was losing altitude. Suddenly, it emitted a burst of sparks and showered the area with burning hot slag. This slag killed the dog and injured the teenage son's arm. Dahl then beached his boat and began taking photographs. Soon thereafter, the 6 UFOs flew off toward Canada. Dahl attempted to use his radio, but it was jammed, so he returned to port in Tacoma, Washington. There, he gave his evidence, including his camera, the film, and the examples of metallic slag, to his boss, a man named Fred Lee Chrisman. The next morning, Chrisman went to Maury Island to investigate, and wouldn't you know it, he saw a UFO too. The event should have ended there. Just another UFO sighting. There are thousands every year. But the very next day, the world of UFOs changed forever. On June 24th, 1947, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying his own private plane over the Cascade Mountains. He was assisting with a search and rescue mission for a crashed airplane. At about 2 p.m., a bright flash lit up his instrument panel. It drew his attention to the skies north of Mount Rainier.
I observed far to my left and to the north a formation of very bright objects coming from the vicinity of Mount Baker, flying very close to the mountain tops and traveling at a tremendous speed. They didn't fly like any aircraft I had seen before. They flew in a definite formation, but erratically, like speedboats on rough water.
That evening, Arnold spoke with a reporter for the East Oregonian newspaper. He said the objects, quote, flew like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. This phrasing reached the Associated Press, which then described the UFOs as saucer-like, and that is how we got the term flying saucer. Yet according to Arnold, the UFOs were not saucer-shaped. Instead, they had the boomerang shape of the flying wing design, much like the current B-2 bomber. However, in 1947, the B-2 didn't exist. What did exist was a prototype aircraft developed by the Nazis during World War II. It was called the Horten HO-229. This design was captured by the Americans and then further developed in secret. Here's a side-by-side comparison of what Arnold said he saw versus the Horten HO-229. Not an exact match, but pretty close. Now, to give you a sense of the timeline, the alleged UFO crash at Roswell occurred 10 days later on July 4th. Then, by about July 20th, so a couple weeks after Roswell, 2 military intelligence officers named Captain William Davidson and Frank M. Brown paid Kenneth Arnold a visit. He told them about everything he saw, and then they returned to their base in California. These 2 officers will become very important in just a minute, but let's return to Maury Island and the supposed UFOs spotted by Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman. Chrisman had called a man named Raymond Palmer, who was the editor of a pulp sci-fi conspiracy magazine called Amazing Stories. Palmer then contacted Kenneth Arnold, who at this point was famous due to his UFO sighting, and he offered him $200 to fly to Maury Island and investigate. Arnold agreed and arrived in Tacoma on July 29th. When he got there, he discovered that someone, anonymously, had booked him a hotel room at the nicest spot in town, and oddly enough, no rooms were available anywhere else. The next day, Kenneth Arnold met with Harold Dahl, the man who originally claimed to see the UFOs. And long story short, Arnold was not impressed. Dahl did not seem credible at all. The examples of metallic slag from the UFO just looked like volcanic rock. And as for the photographs that Dahl supposedly took, Fred Chrisman had somehow managed to lose them. So, Arnold then spoke to Fred Chrisman. At this point, Arnold became very unimpressed. He got the impression that Chrisman was a total fraud and was also concealing his true identity. Plus, Arnold was prohibited from visiting Dahl's teenage son, who was supposedly still in the hospital. And remember the other two crewmen aboard Dahl's boat? Both had mysteriously disappeared. And to make matters worse, Arnold couldn't even confirm if Dahl or Chrisman were actually harbor patrolmen. Dahl's boat turned out to be nothing more than a rickety old fishing boat. Still, Arnold had just seen 9 UFOs himself a few weeks earlier, and he wanted to be thorough. So, he called the 2 military intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank M. Brown, who had debriefed Arnold following his own UFO encounter. But here's something odd. When he called Lieutenant Brown, Brown refused to take the call on the base. Instead, he quickly called Arnold back from a public payphone off the base. He and Captain Davidson then immediately, that same day, flew up to Washington to investigate. Yet according to Arnold, both men seemed entirely uninterested as soon as they got there.
They gave me the impression they thought Smith and I were the victims of some silly hoax. When we offered them pieces of the UFO fragments, they were just not interested.
The 2 intel officers then returned to the airport to catch a ride home. And here is where things take a dark turn. Fred Chrisman shows up at the airport and gives the 2 officers a box he claims is full of debris from the UFOs. To Kenneth Arnold, however, they just look like a bunch of rocks. Yet the officers take the rocks and board the plane, a military transport. About 20 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashes, and both intel officers are killed. Yet 2 enlisted men aboard the plane managed to parachute to safety. According to them, the plane's left engine caught fire and the emergency firefighting equipment was broken. Yet by their story, this means that the 2 intelligence officers, Davidson and Brown, remained on the plane for a full 10 minutes before it crashed. Why didn't they parachute to safety? There were plenty of parachutes and they had plenty of time. Plus, neither they nor the pilot ever radioed a distress call. And as for Kenneth Arnold, he was disgusted by the whole thing. But before he left, he went to visit Dahl and Chrisman one last time. Yet both men had disappeared. So, why is this story important? What does it have to do with Majestic-12 or the missing trillions mentioned earlier? Well, the story of Maury Island, it changes when you learn one key fact. Fred L. Chrisman was not some low-life hoaxer. He wasn't even a harbor patrolman. He was a U.S. intelligence agent acting under orders. According to declassified CIA files, Chrisman served in the CIA's predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, during World War II. After the war, he studied at an OSS-run internal security school before being transferred to the newly created CIA. He served there as an extended agent specializing in disruption activities. 20 years later, in the 1960s, Fred Chrisman would pop up yet again. This time, he was subpoenaed before a grand jury by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. This, of course, was in connection to the Kennedy assassination. Garrison alleged that Chrisman was involved in the murder of the president. And apparently, Chrisman had a close working relationship with CIA operative Clay Shaw, who was the main target of Garrison's investigation. If you saw the Oliver Stone movie, JFK, this is Clay Shaw, played here by Tommy Lee Jones. Chrisman was the first person Shaw called after learning he was going to be arrested. The two must have been close. And on a side note, the FBI agent who investigated the Maury Island UFO sighting was none other than Guy Bannister. This is him in real life, and this is his character in JFK. According to Jim Garrison, Guy Bannister was also deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination. But anyway, now that we know what Chrisman truly was, let's look at the Maury Island affair again. Only this time, not as a UFO sighting, but as a sophisticated disinformation campaign, or PsyOP, run by a professional intelligence agent. First, Chrisman found a dupe, Harold A. Dahl. He was probably nothing more than a local fisherman. Chrisman acquired some sort of leverage over Dahl, maybe blackmail. He told Dahl exactly what to say in terms of the UFOs and all the details. Obviously, there never were any photographs. There was no injured teenage son, no metallic slag, and, hopefully, no dead dog. Remember the anonymously booked hotel room for Kenneth Arnold? It turns out that room was bugged. Verbatim transcripts of all Arnold's conversations and interviews inside the room were sent directly to United Press International. Chrisman did that. He also contacted the Amazing Stories editor, Raymond Palmer. Chrisman had a working relationship with Palmer. He had contacted him several times before, and he likely suggested that Palmer hire Kenneth Arnold to investigate. Why? Because at that time, Kenneth Arnold was famous for UFOs. And what about the 2 military intelligence officers who died after takeoff? I can't say for certain, but let's play Sherlock Holmes. The only 2 survivors were the 2 enlisted men who parachuted to safety. What if those men had the same employer as Chrisman? What if they either killed or incapacitated the 2 intel officers, as well as the pilot, before ditching the plane? This might explain why neither Captain Davidson nor Lieutenant Brown parachuted to safety. They had plenty of time, and no one sent a distress call. So I wonder, what was in the box, the one that Chrisman handed to Davidson and Brown? Was it a signal, giving the green light to 2 possible assassins aboard the plane? It's possible. It's also important to remember that all these events took place roughly 2 weeks after Roswell. There is no evidence that the Maury Island UFO sighting took place before Roswell on June 21st. That date comes from Chrisman. So it's highly likely that this PsyOP was activated immediately after Roswell, not before. So again, what does all this mean? It means that a very sinister part of America's intelligence community went to significant lengths, including possibly murder, to plant disinformation about UFOs in 1947. What could possibly be the motivation for that? My guess is that it was the beginning of a continuous and ongoing, even today, disinformation campaign designed to muddy the waters of the UFO issue, to mix truth with lies and misdirection to create a lasting cover story. But a cover story for what?
I would submit to you that if you move $40 billion, $40 trillion out of these different legal systems and into a new system, that you can earn enough money, dividends and interest, to pay the ongoing costs of a global government.
A global government. Every quote-unquote conspiracy theorist's worst nightmare. The New World Order. Is that what this is really about? Or is it something even stranger? In 1929, a wealthy American inventor named Thomas Townsend Brown published a paper in the journal Science and Invention titled How I Control Gravitation. He claimed to have discovered a way to move objects or create an anti-gravity effect by running a high voltage electrical current through them. Without getting lost in the physics, his process, which he called electrogravitics, created a very similar distortion in space-time, seen here, that the modern-day Alcubierre drive proposes to do for faster-than-light travel. Brown, it turns out, was just a few decades ahead of his time. It's important to understand that Brown's experiments to prove this effect were both widely observed and repeatable. Yet by the 1920s, Einsteinian physics had become dominant, the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. According to this doctrine, only mass could affect gravity. Electricity could not. So when Brown demonstrated his technology and levitated objects in his lab, it had to be something else. Ions charging the air, anything but anti-gravity. And to make matters worse, Brown's experiments violated the laws of physics, including the law of conservation of energy. So of course he had to be wrong, right? And can you guess what shape Brown's flying anti-gravity devices were? A disc, a flying saucer. And if these saucers had been scaled up and put into production, they would have blown the competition to pieces. If you look at power to thrust ratios in terms of newtons per kilowatt, a modern day jet fighter produces 15 newtons per kilowatt. But Brown's electrogravitic thruster produced as much as 70,000 newtons per kilowatt. This made it an over-unity device, meaning you get more power out of it than you put into it. This is the holy grail of power generation and science. This is the invention that would completely remake the world as we know it. A trip to Alpha Centauri, 4.3 light years from Earth? That would take about a week. So we're talking about Star Trek type stuff, a warp drive. Too good to be true? Maybe. But understand that Thomas Townsend Brown was not some eccentric inventor that no one believed. He worked at the pinnacle of US weapons development all throughout World War II. The military gave him the highest clearances. He was one of the top minds in his field. And this is to say nothing of all the exotic technologies developed by the Nazis during World War II as well. If you want to learn more about that, check out my last video about anti-gravity called Dark Science. It's linked below. So, returning to Catherine Austin Fitts, is she right? Is there a separate world government with trillions of dollars in hidden funding? And if so, to what end? Some speculate there is a secret space program. Others say there is a breakaway civilization. But whatever the answer is, it seems clear that somewhere, some select few know something big that the rest of us do not. And as the Maury Island case shows, they are willing to go to great lengths to hide it. What discovery was made, either technological or extraterrestrial, either in modern times or in ancient times, that led some to believe that the world needed to be split into two realities? In the public reality, the one that we all live in, the world is made of nation states with sovereign governments and rule of law. Science is regular science, the kind we use to build cars and airplanes and smartphones. But in the other reality, the one kept so thoroughly hidden behind layer upon layer of disinformation and muddied waters, there is another power. It has its own rules and objectives. It has its own science, one very different from ours, and maybe a science that's able to cross that nebulous threshold between technology and magic. I started this video with the story of filmmaker Jamie Chandray, who mysteriously received the MJ-12 documents at his house in LA. But why him? Some random, down-on-his-luck filmmaker? Extraterrestrial biological entities, the document said. Alien beings with 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, a mouth, and a nose. They're about 4 feet tall, and they have 4 fingers instead of 5. That reeks of Hollywood. A place where aliens are just humans with weird-looking heads. Neither Chandray nor the UFO researchers working with him had the knowledge or background to fabricate the MJ-12 documents. The formatting, the language, the markings, they all checked out under professional scrutiny. So who could do that? Not some amateur hoaxer, but a modern-day Fred Chrisman. But that mythology of UFOs and what aliens actually look like, it started in the 1940s, and it continues to this day. Movie after movie, sighting after sighting. Which ones are real? Which ones are fake? No one knows. The PsyOP that began with Fred Chrisman and Maury Island has done its job very, very well.
Our lives have become wall-to-wall uncertainty. We can't discern if the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor today, we would spend 10 years discussing whether it was a false flag, whether it was actually the Japanese, whether there was any attack, whether it was a sound stage, whether it was a PsyOP, whether it was
No one knows what is up or down anymore. And perhaps that is the point. Because if you've got something really big to hide, whether it's a spaceship or a world government, how else would you do it? Perhaps that's where all the missing trillions have gone. It's possible.